Winter in the Viking world did not arrive politely. It did not knock. It simply showed up one day and refused to leave for several months, bringing darkness, wind, and a kind of cold that feels less like weather and more like a personal disagreement with the human body. For people living in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, roughly between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, surviving winter was not a cozy seasonal experience involving fireplaces, thick blankets, or warm drinks by the hearth. In fact, fireplaces as we imagine them today were largely absent. There were no stone chimneys drawing smoke neatly upward, no separate rooms warmed evenly by controlled fire. Instead, Vikings lived through Arctic and subarctic winters using methods that were practical, uncomfortable, and very likely smelled faintly of damp wool and old fish. And somehow, most of them lived through it. If you enjoy quietly drifting through these kinds of historical inconveniences, you may want to remember to gently subscribe, though nothing dramatic will happen if you forget. The typical Viking home, known as a longhouse, was designed less for comfort and more for not immediately dying. These buildings were long, narrow structures made from timber, turf, stone, or whatever materials were locally available, which often meant a combination of all three stacked together with quiet desperation. The walls were thick, not because Vikings loved insulation, but because piling earth and sod against wood was one of the few ways to slow down heat loss in a climate that seemed actively hostile to exposed surfaces. Roofs were heavy and low, covered in turf that added insulation while also quietly leaking whenever it felt like it. Inside, there were no separate bedrooms, kitchens, or living rooms. Everyone and everything existed together in one shared space, including people, animals, tools, smoke, and the general awareness that winter was still not finished. Heat came from a central open hearth, which was not a fireplace in the modern sense, but rather a fire burning in the middle of the floor. There was no chimney. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the building materials, slowly, reluctantly, and often not very efficiently. This meant that the interior of a Viking longhouse was frequently filled with smoke, creating an environment that was warm-ish near the fire, freezing near the walls, and mildly toxic everywhere else. Breathing was a secondary concern. The goal was warmth. People slept on raised wooden platforms along the sides of the house, far from the center, where temperatures dropped quickly. To compensate, they used layers of woolen blankets, animal skins, and shared body heat, which was not optional and not discussed. Clothing was another line of defense. Viking garments were made primarily of wool, which retains heat even when damp, a crucial feature in a place where everything was always damp. Linen was used underneath when possible, but wool did the real work. Multiple layers were worn indoors and outdoors, and clothing was rarely removed unless absolutely necessary. Washing was not frequent, partly because water froze, and partly because taking off your clothes in winter was a bold and unnecessary risk. Food also played a quiet but critical role in survival. Fresh food disappeared quickly once winter set in, so Vikings relied heavily on preserved items. Dried fish, smoked meat, fermented dairy, and grains stored from the previous harvest. These foods were not exciting, but they were dense in calories, which mattered more than flavor when your body was burning energy just to remain functional. Alcohol, especially beer and mead, was consumed not because it warmed the body in any real physiological sense, but because it made the cold easier to ignore for short periods of time. This did not actually help survival, but it did help morale, which counts for something during months of darkness. Light was limited. Oil lamps made from stone or clay burned animal fat, producing a weak, flickering glow that barely pushed back the dark. Winter days were short, and much of life happened in near darkness or firelight. People worked less, talked more, repaired tools, told stories, and waited. Winter was not conquered, it was endured. And for Vikings, surviving without fireplaces was not impressive or heroic. It was simply the baseline requirement for seeing spring again. Seeing spring again was never guaranteed, and everyone in a Viking household understood this without needing to say it out loud. Winter injuries healed slowly, if at all, and even small problems could quietly turn serious when cold, darkness, and malnutrition worked together with patient efficiency. This is partly why Vikings treated winter as a season for restraint rather than activity. Travel was minimized, raids paused, and farming halted entirely, leaving people confined to their longhouses for long stretches of time with very little personal space and an impressive amount of patience. The design of the longhouse itself reflected this reality. Its long, narrow shape reduced exposed surface area, helping to retain heat, while its low ceiling trapped warm air closer to the ground where people lived. This also trapped smoke, of course, but that was considered an acceptable trade. Over time, inhabitants developed a tolerance to smoky air that modern lungs would find alarming. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Vikings likely suffered from chronic respiratory irritation, watery eyes, and coughing, but these were long-term concerns, and winter demanded short-term survival. Animals were often brought inside during the coldest months, particularly valuable livestock like sheep or goats. This added warmth through body heat and fermentation of smells, creating a living environment that was warmer but significantly less pleasant. The presence of animals also meant noise, movement, and the occasional reminder that hygiene was not a top priority in winter survival strategies. Bedding consisted of straw, hay, or dried grass layered beneath animal skins. These materials were insulating, but also attracted insects and absorbed moisture, making sleep a practical necessity rather than a refreshing experience. People slept fully clothed, often huddled together, because privacy was not useful when hypothermia was a possibility. Children, elders, and anyone weakened by illness stayed closest to the hearth, where temperatures were marginally less hostile. Fuel was another constant concern. Firewood was gathered during warmer months and rationed carefully throughout winter. Burning too much too quickly meant running out before the cold ended, which was not an acceptable outcome. Fires were kept low and steady rather than large and comforting. Ashes were reused to insulate embers overnight, allowing the fire to be restarted in the morning without wasting precious fuel. This required attention and routine because losing a fire during winter meant cold hands, frozen food, and a noticeable decline in morale. Food preparation slowed as well. Cooking took place over the same central hearth used for heating, and meals were simple, repetitive, and designed to last. Stews were common, combining preserved meats, grains, and whatever vegetables had survived storage. These meals were filling but unremarkable, eaten slowly and often in silence. Hunger was familiar but usually managed, as long as the previous year's harvest had been adequate. When it was not, winter became much more dangerous, and sagas quietly acknowledge years when starvation thinned communities without much ceremony. Psychological survival mattered too, though it was not described in modern terms. Storytelling, tool repair, and simple crafts helped pass the time and provided structure to days that otherwise blurred together in darkness. The long nights encouraged oral tradition, and many myths, legends, and sagas were likely refined during these months, told repeatedly as a way to keep minds occupied while bodies waited. Light remained scarce. Oil lamps were used sparingly, and people adapted to working and resting by firelight or near total darkness. Vision adjusted, routines slowed, and expectations lowered. The absence of fireplaces as a separate architectural feature was not seen as a problem because the idea of evenly heated rooms simply did not exist. Warmth was localized, temporary, and shared. Survival depended on collective habits rather than individual comfort. In this way, Viking winters were not heroic battles against nature, but long negotiations with it, marked by compromise, endurance, and the quiet understanding that comfort was optional, but cooperation was not. Cooperation inside the longhouse was not a moral ideal so much as a practical necessity, especially once winter reached its deepest and least forgiving phase. By this point, daylight had become a brief suggestion rather than a reliable feature of the day, and temperatures remained low enough that even simple tasks felt deliberately inconvenient. People moved less, spoke more quietly, and conserved energy whenever possible because unnecessary movement meant unnecessary heat loss. The layout of the longhouse reinforced this behavior. Benches and sleeping platforms lined the walls, creating narrow walkways that discouraged pacing and encouraged sitting still. The central hearth remained the heart of daily life, but it was not something you gathered around for pleasure. It was something you positioned yourself near based on need, age, and social hierarchy, with the most vulnerable closest and the strongest further away. Smoke continued to accumulate near the ceiling, slowly staining the rafters and adding another layer of insulation in the form of soot, which, while unpleasant, did reduce drafts over time. Clothing became increasingly important as winter wore on. Garments were repaired repeatedly, patched, repatched, and reinforced, because making new clothing in winter was difficult and wasteful. Woolen tunics, cloaks, and trousers were worn day and night, often stiff from moisture and smoke. Footwear was basic, usually leather shoes or boots lined with fur or straw, which provided minimal protection from frozen ground. Indoors, shoes were sometimes removed to preserve them, but this meant cold floors, so people wrapped their feet in additional fabric instead. Gloves and mittens existed, but were not universal, and hands frequently went numb during routine tasks like eating, carving, or tool maintenance. The lack of fireplaces also meant that heat was uneven and unpredictable. Areas near the hearth could become uncomfortably hot, while areas just a few steps away were cold enough to see your breath. This temperature gradient shaped how people positioned themselves throughout the day, slowly shifting as the fire changed intensity. Night was particularly difficult. As the fire burned lower, temperatures dropped, and everyone relied heavily on bedding and shared warmth. Fires were rarely kept large overnight due to fuel conservation, so mornings began cold, with stiff fingers and the quiet task of coaxing embers back to life. This daily ritual mattered more than it seemed. A failed fire restart could delay cooking, reduce morale, and turn an already unpleasant morning into a problem-solving exercise. Water access was another challenge. Streams and wells froze, requiring ice to be broken regularly. Water was carried inside and stored carefully to prevent freezing, but it often became partially frozen anyway. This limited washing, cooking options, and anything resembling comfort. Hygiene declined in winter, not out of neglect, but because warmth was prioritized over cleanliness. Illness spread more easily in these conditions, and without effective medical treatment, recovery depended on rest, nutrition, and patience. Elders passed down practical knowledge about surviving winter, including how to dress, when to eat, how to ration supplies, and how to recognize when someone was becoming dangerously cold. These lessons were learned early and remembered well because forgetting them had consequences. Children grew up understanding that winter was not something to enjoy, but something to get through. Despite all of this, Viking communities did not collapse each winter. The absence of fireplaces did not doom them, because their entire way of life had evolved around this limitation. Homes, clothing, food systems, and social structures all compensated in small, unremarkable ways. Survival came from accumulation rather than innovation. No single method made winter safe, but together they made it survivable, which was considered sufficient. Sufficiency was the unspoken goal of a Viking winter, not comfort, not warmth, and certainly not happiness in any modern sense. As winter stretched on, time itself seemed to slow, marked less by days and more by routines that repeated with dependable dullness. The fire was tended, food was rationed, clothing was mended, and everyone waited. The absence of fireplaces meant that heat was never a background feature of life. It was always present as a task, something that required attention, planning, and restraint. Longhouses were designed to hold warmth as long as possible, but they could not create it on their own. Every degree of heat came from burned fuel or shared bodies, and both were finite resources. This encouraged a mindset where excess was quietly discouraged. Loud activity, unnecessary movement, and wasteful behavior were not punished formally, but they were noticed. Winter amplified inefficiency. Storage spaces inside the longhouse were carefully managed. Food was kept in sealed containers, hung from rafters, or buried in insulated pits to prevent spoilage and freezing. Meat was often kept just cold enough to preserve it without turning solid, a delicate balance that depended entirely on ambient temperature and experience. Grain stores were checked frequently, because moisture or rodents could quietly destroy a family's chances of lasting until spring. This constant low-level vigilance shaped daily thought patterns. There was little room for distraction when survival depended on long-term planning and short-term discipline. The lack of fireplaces also meant that heat could not be easily directed to specific tasks. Drying clothing, for example, required careful placement near the hearth, rotating items slowly to avoid burning them while still removing moisture. Wet clothing was dangerous, but over-drying wasted fuel and risked fire. Everything happened slowly, with attention. Meals were eaten warm when possible, because reheating food repeatedly consumed precious wood. Leftovers were managed with care, often kept near the hearth to prevent freezing, but not spoilage. The cold also affected tools. Metal became brittle, wood cracked, and repairs were constant. Tool maintenance became a winter activity not out of choice, but necessity. Fishing nets, farming tools and weapons were repaired in anticipation of spring, using firelight and numb fingers. Social interactions shifted accordingly. Winter was not a season for large gatherings or celebrations, except for specific festivals that marked survival milestones. Most social life happened within the household, reinforcing bonds through proximity rather than intention. Conflicts had to be managed carefully because there was nowhere to escape to, and unresolved tension made an already difficult season worse. Stories and shared memories filled the long evenings, providing continuity and distraction. Many of the sagas that later defined Viking cultural identity likely evolved in these conditions, shaped by repetition, low light, and the need to stay awake without moving too much. The cold outside was constant, but inside, the struggle was quieter. It was a slow test of patience rather than strength. Surviving without fireplaces was not a feat of engineering or clever design. It was the result of habits repeated across generations, refined not for comfort, but for endurance. Winter did not reward innovation quickly. It rewarded consistency, attention, and the willingness to accept that warmth would always be temporary. Temporary warmth shaped how Vikings thought about time, effort, and expectation during the winter months, and it quietly lowered the standard for what counted as a good day. A successful day was not warm or pleasant. It was simply one where nothing went wrong. The fire stayed alive, food lasted, no one slipped into illness, and the structure of the house held against wind and snow. Without fireplaces to stabilize indoor temperatures, the longhouse responded constantly to the outside world. Storms were felt immediately. Strong winds forced smoke back down through roof openings, filling the interior with thicker haze and stinging eyes. Snow piled against walls and doors, improving insulation but making exits heavier and more reluctant. When temperatures rose slightly, melting snow seeped into the structure, dampening floors and bedding, which then froze again when the cold returned. This cycle repeated often enough that dampness became a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. Vikings adapted by assuming that nothing would ever be completely dry during winter. Instead, they focused on keeping essential items functional rather than comfortable. Clothing was rotated near the hearth in careful shifts, never fully dried, just dried enough. Bedding was shaken out when possible, which was not often. Floors were covered with straw or reeds, replaced periodically to absorb moisture and provide minimal insulation from frozen ground. The absence of fireplaces also affected how space was understood. There were no warm corners to retreat to, no private areas where heat lingered independently. Warmth existed in relation to the fire and to other people. This reinforced the communal nature of winter life. Solitude was limited and not especially valued during this season. People were rarely alone, not out of preference, but because separation meant exposure. This constant proximity shaped social behavior in subtle ways. Conversations slowed. Gestures became smaller. Everyone learned to occupy space without demanding too much of it. Silence became common, not uncomfortable, just efficient. Food preparation reflected the same philosophy. Winter meals were repetitive by design. Variety required resources, and resources were better saved than enjoyed prematurely. The body needed calories, not novelty. Fat became especially valuable, both as food and as fuel for lamps. Animal fat burned longer than wood alone, and provided a steadier, though faint, source of light. Lamps were positioned carefully to avoid drafts, and their glow marked the rhythm of the evening. When lamps went out, activity stopped. There was little reason to stay awake in total darkness. Sleep followed the fire rather than the clock. The lack of fireplaces also meant that nighttime cold was accepted rather than resisted. People prepared for sleep, knowing that temperatures would drop significantly before morning. Layers were added, bodies drawn closer, and movement reduced. Waking during the night was avoided because leaving the warmth of shared bedding made returning to sleep unnecessarily difficult. In this way, winter reshaped daily rhythms entirely. The concept of productivity shifted from output to preservation. Making it through the season intact was the achievement. Archaeological evidence suggests that these methods worked often enough to sustain communities across generations, though not without loss. Infant mortality was higher in winter. The elderly were vulnerable. Illness lingered longer. These outcomes were not framed as failures of design, but as accepted risks. Life in the Viking world was not optimized for individual longevity. It was structured for continuity. The absence of fireplaces did not represent a missing technology waiting to be discovered. It reflected a world where solutions emerged slowly, shaped by available materials, climate, and habit. When spring finally arrived, it did not erase the hardship of winter. It simply made movement easier and survival less demanding. The longhouse did not change. The hearth remained the same. But daylight returned, fuel became less precious, and people could spread out again. Winter was over, not conquered, just completed. And that, quietly, was enough. Completion did not bring relief so much as a slow release of tension that had been held quietly for months. And even then, winter rarely ended all at once. Cold lingered in the ground, in the walls, and in habits that were slow to disappear. Fires were still kept modest, clothing remained layered, and no one trusted the weather enough to relax completely. The longhouse, having endured another season without fireplaces, showed the evidence of survival in subtle ways. Soot thickened along the rafters, darkening the interior and further sealing small gaps where heat once escaped. Floors were uneven from moisture and foot traffic, softened by layers of straw that had absorbed an entire winter's worth of dampness. Repairs began as soon as conditions allowed, because winter damage was expected rather than surprising. Cracked beams, sagging roof sections, and warped doors were addressed with practical urgency, not complaint. The absence of fireplaces meant that heat had never been confined to a structure that could be repaired or improved. It was always temporary, always improvised, and always dependent on people rather than architecture. This shaped how Vikings thought about their homes. A longhouse was not a refuge from the environment, it was a compromise with it. Archaeological remains show that many longhouses were rebuilt repeatedly on the same site, generation after generation, with slight adjustments rather than radical improvements. Thickening walls, improving roof coverage, and refining hearth placement mattered more than introducing entirely new heating concepts. Fireplaces with chimneys would eventually appear in Northern Europe, but during much of the Viking Age, the open hearth remained standard, not because Vikings lacked imagination, but because the materials, labor, and design knowledge required for safer, more efficient fireplaces were not always available or practical in rural settlements. Social memory played a role as well. People built what they knew had worked before. Winter survival was conservative by nature. Experimentation carried risk, and risk was expensive in cold climates. Instead, knowledge was passed down quietly through observation and repetition. Children learned where to sit, when to move, and how to dress without formal instruction. These habits were absorbed naturally because deviation was uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous. Even as spring approached, food remained tightly managed. Stores were not assumed to be abundant until fresh sources were secured. Fishing resumed cautiously as ice receded, and livestock were brought outside gradually. The longhouse emptied slightly, giving people more space and air, but it never became warm in the modern sense. Comfort was relative, and expectations remained modest. The idea of evenly heated rooms, personal warmth, and independent control over temperature simply did not exist as goals. What existed was a shared understanding that winter was something to prepare for collectively and endure together. The absence of fireplaces reinforced this. There was no private fire, no individual source of warmth to retreat to. Heat belonged to the group, and survival depended on maintaining that shared resource. This had lasting social effects. Authority within the household often rested with those who managed resources well, not those who displayed strength or status. Good judgment during winter mattered more than bravery. A person who wasted fuel or food endangered everyone, and this was understood without needing formal rules. In this way, winter acted as a quiet regulator of behavior. It rewarded patience, foresight, and restraint, and it punished excess with cold indifference. Modern interpretations sometimes frame Viking survival as rugged or heroic, but living without fireplaces in Arctic conditions was rarely dramatic. It was repetitive, exhausting, and carefully managed. Most days passed without notable events, which was considered a success. The lack of fireplaces did not create stories of triumph, it created long stretches of waiting. When historians reconstruct Viking life, the focus often falls on raids, ships, and expansion, but these activities depended entirely on surviving winters at home. Without enduring months of darkness and cold in smoke-filled longhouses, none of the outward movement of Viking society would have been possible. Winter was the foundation, not the interruption. Surviving it without fireplaces was not a clever solution waiting to be improved. It was the quiet baseline of life in the north. And every spring, when the fire burned a little lower and the door opened more easily, the fact that everyone was still there was the only outcome that truly mattered. That outcome, simply still being there, shaped how Vikings remembered winter once it passed, which is to say they mostly did not dwell on it. Winter was not romanticized in everyday memory. It was not retold as a story of triumph or suffering. It was treated as a necessary interval that happened every year and demanded the same quiet respect each time. The absence of fireplaces was folded into this acceptance. No one framed it as a problem to be solved urgently, because life already functioned within its limits. The longhouse hearth did its job imperfectly but consistently, and consistency mattered more than improvement when survival depended on predictability. Daily life in winter, therefore, became a practice in restraint. People learned to measure effort carefully because energy was as valuable as fuel. Tasks were planned to minimize movement, and activities were grouped together near the hearth to reduce unnecessary exposure to colder areas of the house. Sitting idle was not laziness, but conservation. Even conversation followed this logic. Long silences were common and not uncomfortable. Speaking required breath. Breath cooled the body, and words were saved for when they mattered. The house itself absorbed these patterns. Over time, smoke-darkened interiors reduced glare from snow outside, easing the strain on eyes already irritated by soot. The low ceiling kept warmth closer to where people lived, and the packed earth floors, while cold, remained stable. Everything about the space reinforced stillness. When storms passed overhead, the sound of wind against turf and timber became background noise, something acknowledged briefly and then ignored. Leaving the house during severe weather was avoided unless absolutely necessary. Winter did not encourage exploration. It encouraged staying put and enduring conditions as they were. Children grew up internalizing these rhythms without explanation. They learned early that winter required fewer questions and more patience. Play was quieter. Movements were smaller. Curiosity turned inward towards stories, small crafts, and observation. Elders, whose bodies tolerated cold less easily, remained close to the hearth, serving as anchors of knowledge rather than active participants in daily labor. Their presence reinforced continuity, reminding younger members of the household that winter had been survived before and would likely be survived again. This generational perspective mattered. It reduced panic and discouraged short-term thinking. Without fireplaces, warmth was never guaranteed, so expectations were adjusted accordingly. A mildly warm day indoors was considered unusually good. A cold one was normal. There was no sense of entitlement to comfort. Instead, there was an understanding that comfort was temporary and conditional. Even during moments of relative ease, such as communal meals or storytelling, the fire remained central and watched. Someone was always aware of its state because neglect could undo hours of careful effort. This vigilance became instinctive. It shaped attention and responsibility within the household. Everyone contributed in small ways, whether by gathering fuel, tending the fire, repairing clothing, or simply not wasting resources. Winter magnified individual behavior, making it visible and consequential. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities which managed these dynamics well were more resilient over time. Settlements persisted not because they were warm, but because they were disciplined. The absence of fireplaces did not weaken social bonds. It strengthened them through shared dependence. Heat was not something you owned. It was something you maintained together. When spring finally allowed people to spend more time outdoors, the contrast was noticeable but understated. There was relief, but not celebration. Work resumed gradually, bodies adjusted slowly, and habits loosened one by one. The hearth remained, unchanged, ready for the next cycle. Looking back, it becomes clear that Viking survival in Arctic winters without fireplaces was not about clever tricks or extreme toughness. It was about designing life around limitations and then refusing to argue with them. The cold was not defeated. It was managed, tolerated, and waited out. In a world without modern heating, this approach was not admirable or optional. It was simply how things were done. And because it worked often enough, it was repeated, quietly, year after year, until it became indistinguishable from life itself. Life itself, in the Viking world, adjusted to winter so thoroughly that it is difficult to separate the season from the culture that formed around it. The lack of fireplaces did not stand out as a hardship in isolation, because everything else was already shaped to compensate. Architecture, clothing, diet, and social behavior all assumed cold as a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. The longhouse hearth was never meant to make the interior comfortable in a modern sense. It existed to prevent death by exposure, and anything beyond that was considered an unexpected bonus. This low threshold for success influenced how Vikings evaluated risk and reward throughout their lives. When you grow up in an environment where warmth is fragile and conditional, you learn early that comfort is not something to rely on. This mindset extended beyond winter survival into how Vikings approached travel, labor, and even conflict. Preparation mattered more than optimism. Redundancy mattered more than speed. These values were reinforced each winter as families returned to the same routines and accepted the same limitations. The absence of fireplaces also affected sensory experience. The smell of smoke, wool, damp wood, and animal fat became the baseline scent of home. Eyes adjusted to dim light. Ears grew accustomed to the quiet crackle of fire and the low sounds of breathing and movement in shared space. Over time, these conditions ceased to register as discomfort and became familiar background. This familiarity reduced stress and helped maintain psychological stability during long periods of confinement. Modern observers often underestimate the importance of this adaptation. The human body and mind are remarkably capable of adjusting to poor conditions if those conditions are consistent. In Viking longhouses, nothing was ideal, but everything was predictable. That predictability made winter survivable. Seasonal knowledge accumulated slowly. People learned exactly how much fuel a household needed, how long food would last, and how cold the interior would become at different times of day. This knowledge was not written down. It was remembered collectively and transmitted through routine. Mistakes were costly, so successful patterns persisted. The lack of fireplaces also limited specialization. There were no warm workspaces for delicate crafts or extended indoor production. Winter labor focused on tasks that could be done near the hearth and tolerated interruption, such as repairing nets, sharpening tools, and weaving. More complex activities waited for warmer seasons. This natural pause structured the annual cycle of work and rest. The year was not evenly productive, and it was not expected to be. Winter imposed a slowdown that modern schedules would find inefficient, but that proved sustainable over time. Health outcomes reflected this balance. While winter increased vulnerability to illness and injury, it also enforced periods of reduced physical strain. People worked less, moved less, and rested more, even if that rest was cold and uncomfortable. The absence of fireplaces did not prevent recovery entirely. It merely slowed it. Survival statistics from archaeological contexts suggest that communities adapted well enough to persist, even if individual suffering was common. What matters historically is not that Viking winters were harsh, which they were, but that the systems supporting life functioned within those conditions. Fireplaces would eventually appear, bringing cleaner air and more controllable heat, but they did not fundamentally change the logic of winter survival. They improved it gradually. Until then, Vikings relied on habits rather than technology. This reliance produced a culture that valued endurance without celebrating it, practicality without praising it, and survival without mythologizing it. The winter longhouse was not a stage for heroism. It was a place to wait, conserve, and maintain what already existed. And when viewed through this lens, the question of how Vikings survived Arctic winters without fireplaces has a quiet, unsatisfying answer. They did not survive by doing anything remarkable. They survived by adjusting their expectations downward and their cooperation upward until the cold became manageable. Not conquered, not welcomed, just endured, with enough consistency to allow life to continue. Continuing life under those adjusted expectations meant that winter became less an event and more a condition, something always present in the background of planning and memory. Even during warmer months, Vikings prepared for cold by gathering fuel, repairing roofs, and storing food, because winter failure was cumulative. One poorly prepared season could weaken a household for years. The absence of fireplaces reinforced this long view. Since heat could not be stored or generated efficiently indoors, it had to be anticipated well in advance. Woodcutting in summer was not an act of foresight so much as an obligation. Entire days were devoted to collecting and drying fuel, knowing that each log represented a future evening of tolerable cold rather than comfort. Storage spaces were expanded or reinforced because protecting supplies from moisture and pests mattered as much as acquiring them. Winter planning was therefore woven into every other season. This integration reduced the psychological shock of cold when it arrived. There was no illusion that winter could be ignored or postponed. It arrived on schedule, and life adjusted accordingly. The longhouse remained central to this cycle. Its lack of fireplaces kept internal space honest. There were no false pockets of warmth to encourage excess. If the fire burned low, everyone felt it. If fuel was wasted, everyone noticed. This transparency shaped responsibility. Resource management was visible, and accountability was immediate. In modern environments, heating systems often hide the cost of warmth. In Viking households, warmth was inseparable from effort, making its value constantly apparent. Children learned this lesson early, watching adults ration fuel, reposition themselves as temperatures shifted. Over time, this created a shared intuition about winter behavior that required little verbal explanation. Silence, stillness, and moderation were learned responses. Food culture reflected the same mindset. Winter dishes were not designed to impress. They were designed to sustain. Flavors were simple, textures predictable, and portions controlled. Eating became a functional activity rather than a social highlight. Meals were appreciated quietly, not because they were enjoyable, but because they existed. The lack of fireplaces also limited social stratification within the home. While hierarchy certainly existed in Viking society, winter conditions flattened some distinctions. Everyone endured the same cold air and smoke. Wealth might provide better clothing or more food, but it could not eliminate discomfort entirely. This shared exposure reinforced a sense of collective fate during winter months. No one escaped the season. Even chieftains slept in longhouses subject to the same drafts and temperature swings. This may help explain the strong emphasis on loyalty and cooperation in Viking communities. When survival depends on group behavior, individual privilege becomes less meaningful during hardship. Winter also shaped emotional expression. Excessive complaint served no purpose, and optimism was tempered by experience. Emotional resilience developed not through positive thinking, but through repetition. Each winter survived reinforced the belief that the next one could be endured as well. The absence of fireplaces became just another fixed parameter of life, like darkness or snow. People did not compare their conditions to hypothetical alternatives. They compared them to last year. As long as conditions were not worse, winter was considered manageable. Archaeology supports this view. There is little evidence of dramatic midwinter abandonment of settlements, suggesting that most communities found their equilibrium. Failures occurred, but they were not the norm. When fireplaces and chimneys eventually spread, they were adopted gradually, layered onto existing practices rather than replacing them entirely. By then, centuries of adaptation had already shaped social and domestic life. Looking back, the Viking ability to survive Arctic winters without fireplaces appears less mysterious than it first seems. It was not ingenuity alone that sustained them, but a culture built around endurance, preparation, and acceptance. Winter did not require clever solutions. It required consistency. And consistency, practiced quietly and collectively, proved sufficient. Sufficiency through consistency defined the Viking relationship with winter so completely that it left little room for longing or comparison, which may be why written sources from the period say so little about indoor comfort. The sagas describe journeys, conflicts, and feasts, but they rarely linger on how warm anyone felt while sitting at home. In January. This silence is revealing. It suggests that cold interiors and smoke-filled air were not considered noteworthy conditions. They were assumed. The absence of fireplaces was not a flaw in daily life that demanded attention, but a boundary everyone learned to work within. Winter habits were embedded deeply enough that questioning them would have seemed unnecessary. A Viking longhouse did not promise protection from nature. It promised a slower rate of loss. Heat escaped, smoke lingered, and cold crept in around doors and walls, but not fast enough to make survival impossible. That was the standard. Everything else was adjustment. The physical posture of winter life reflected this reality. People sat low, close to the ground and to one another, conserving warmth and energy. Standing for long periods was avoided. Tasks were done seated whenever possible. Even posture became economical. Bodies curled inward, reducing exposed surface area, a habit that persisted unconsciously. Modern observers might describe this as discomfort, but for those living it, it was simply the correct way to occupy space in winter. Time perception also shifted. Without artificial lighting or clocks, days blurred together, shaped more by the fire's condition than by hours. Activity increased when fuel allowed and slowed when it did not. The lack of fireplaces reinforced this fluid schedule. There was no expectation that indoor space should remain equally usable at all times. Some areas of the house were effectively abandoned during the coldest periods, while others became central by necessity. This flexible use of space reduced frustration and helped households adapt without altering the structure itself. Winter knowledge extended beyond the household into the community. Neighbors shared information about weather patterns, fuel availability, and food stores, not out of generosity alone, but because isolation increased risk. A struggling household could become a burden later, so quiet support early in winter benefited everyone. This network of mutual awareness compensated for technological limitations. Without fireplaces to stabilize indoor conditions, social systems absorbed some of the load. Community resilience mattered as much as architectural design. Even religious and spiritual practices reflected winter endurance. Rituals marking seasonal transitions acknowledged the hardship without dramatizing it. They reinforced continuity rather than escape. Winter was not something to defeat spiritually any more than physically. It was something to be respected and waded through. When spring eventually loosened its grip, the return of mobility mattered more than warmth. Doors opened more often, smoke thinned. People spent longer hours outside, even if temperatures remained low. The relief came from movement and light, not from a dramatic change in comfort. Fireplaces, when they later appeared, improved conditions gradually, but they did not transform winter into something pleasant overnight. The underlying habits of restraint and cooperation remained useful, even with better heating. In this sense, the Viking approach to winter survival without fireplaces created a durable cultural framework that outlasted the technology itself. It taught people how to live with limits rather than chase ideal conditions. This perspective is easy to miss when looking backward from a world of central heating and insulated walls. Modern discomfort often feels urgent because it is unexpected. Viking discomfort was expected, planned for, and normalized. That normalization reduced panic and preserved function. The question of survival, then, becomes less about ingenuity and more about alignment. Viking life aligned closely with environmental constraints. Homes leaked heat, but bodies adapted. Air was smoky, but lungs adjusted. Nights were cold, but sleep patterns changed. Nothing was optimized, but everything was synchronized. This synchronization is what allowed communities to persist in environments that seem hostile by modern standards. Surviving Arctic winters without fireplaces did not require exceptional strength or innovation. It required a willingness to accept that warmth would be partial, temporary, and shared, and that this was not a failure. It was the condition of life. When that condition was accepted rather than resisted, winter became survivable. Not easy, not gentle, but manageable. And in a world where survival was the primary metric of success, that was enough. That sense of manageability was the final, understated achievement of Viking winter life, and it explains why the absence of fireplaces never became a defining crisis in their historical experience. When warmth is understood as conditional rather than guaranteed, people stop organizing their lives around comfort and instead organize them around continuity. This distinction mattered. Viking households did not expect winter to improve. They expected themselves to endure it with minimal loss. This expectation shaped emotional responses as much as physical behavior. Anxiety was tempered by routine. Fear was reduced through familiarity. Each winter followed roughly the same pattern, and predictability softened its impact. Even when conditions were severe, they were rarely surprising. Snowstorms, prolonged darkness, and intense cold were anticipated features, not emergencies. The lack of fireplaces reinforced this mindset by preventing false reassurance. There was no illusion of control over the the indoor environment. Heat could not be summoned at will. It had to be earned, repeatedly, through effort and cooperation. This created a quiet attentiveness that carried through every aspect of daily life. People paid attention to the fire, to one another, and to the condition of shared resources. Neglect showed consequences quickly. Awareness, therefore, became habitual. Over generations, this habit shaped cultural attitudes toward hardship. Suffering was not ignored, but it was not dramatized either. It was integrated into life as a known quantity. This integration reduced the emotional volatility that often accompanies difficult conditions. Instead of reacting strongly to discomfort, people adjusted their behavior incrementally. If it grew colder, they moved closer together. If fuel ran low, activity slowed. If illness appeared, effort shifted toward preservation rather than productivity. These adjustments were small, but they accumulated into resilience. The absence of fireplaces also meant that winter knowledge remained embodied rather than abstract. There were no manuals or written instructions. Survival strategies were learned through watching, copying, and repeating. This method of transmission made knowledge flexible and responsive to local conditions. What worked in one valley or coastal settlement could be adapted slightly elsewhere without needing formal redesign. Fire management, clothing choices, and food storage techniques evolved slowly but steadily, guided by experience rather than theory. Archaeological findings reflect this gradual refinement. Changes in longhouse construction over time show incremental improvements in insulation and layout, not sudden leaps in heating technology. This suggests that Viking societies prioritized reliability over experimentation. Fireplaces with chimneys would eventually offer cleaner air and more controlled heat, but adopting them required new materials, skills, and labor investments. Until those became practical, the existing system remained sufficient. Sufficiency, in this context, was not a sign of stagnation, but of alignment. Viking life aligned with environmental constraints closely enough that radical change was unnecessary. This alignment extended beyond winter. It influenced how people approached uncertainty in general. Long-distance travel, trade, and exploration were undertaken only after careful preparation, mirroring winter planning on a larger scale. The same patience that sustained households through cold months supported voyages across dangerous seas. Winter survival at home and exploration abroad were not separate skills. They were expressions of the same disciplined approach to risk. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to view the absence of fireplaces as an obvious flaw waiting to be corrected. But historical systems are rarely optimized according to future standards. They are optimized according to present needs. For Vikings, the present need was not comfort, but persistence. Their homes provided just enough shelter to slow heat loss. Their social structures distributed responsibility. Their habits conserved energy. Together, these elements formed a stable equilibrium. Winter did not push communities constantly to the edge of collapse. It pressed them into a narrower range of behavior, where waste was minimized and cooperation was essential. In that narrow range, life continued. Over time, this narrowness became normal. This longhouse interior, smoky and dim, was not experienced as a place of deprivation, but as the expected setting of winter life. Children raised in these conditions did not imagine alternatives. They learned what worked and accepted what did not. When better heating technologies eventually arrived, they were welcomed, but they did not erase centuries of practiced restraint. The cultural memory of winter endurance persisted, shaping values long after fireplaces appeared. In the end, the question of how Vikings survived Arctic winters without fireplaces reveals less about heating methods and more about human adaptation. Survival did not come from conquering the environment or insulating against it completely. It came from acknowledging limits and designing life within them. Vikings did not eliminate cold from their homes. They learned to live alongside it, patiently, repeatedly, and together. That lesson, unremarkable and unspectacular, was their true survival strategy. That strategy, living alongside cold rather than attempting to erase it, quietly shaped the limits of Viking ambition during winter and clarified what was worth effort and what was not. There was no expectation that winter could be made pleasant, so energy was not wasted trying. This absence of false hope mattered more than it seems. In environments where comfort is expected, its absence feels like failure. In the Viking world, discomfort was the default, and failure was defined more narrowly as collapse, starvation, or loss of life. Everything else existed in the wide middle ground of tolerable difficulty. The lack of fireplaces kept that boundary clear. It prevented the kind of partial comfort that invites frustration when it cannot be maintained. Instead, warmth was episodic and modest, encouraging people to appreciate brief improvements without depending on them. A slightly warmer evening near the hearth was noticed, but it was not assumed to last. This attitude reduced disappointment and stabilized morale across long winters. Seasonal rhythms reinforced this stability. Winter was not a time to expand, innovate aggressively, or seek improvement. It was a time to preserve what already existed. Tools were maintained rather than redesigned. Skills were practiced rather than reinvented. Stories were repeated rather than replaced. This repetition was not boredom, but reinforcement. Familiar narratives, told again and again in firelight, created continuity that countered the disorientation of darkness and confinement. Oral tradition thrived not because winter inspired creativity, but because it demanded structure. Stories filled time that could not be used productively and kept minds engaged while bodies remained still. The absence of fireplaces meant that there were no separate, comfortable spaces to retreat into, so shared experience became unavoidable. This reinforced collective memory and identity. Everyone heard the same stories, learned the same lessons, and absorbed the same values. Winter compressed social life inward, intensifying shared culture. Material culture reflected similar constraints. Household objects were simple, durable, and multifunctional because producing replacements in winter was difficult. Furniture was sparse and practical. Benches served as seats, beds, and work surfaces. Storage containers were designed to protect contents from cold and moisture rather than to organize space neatly. The interior of a longhouse was not cluttered with possessions, partly because excess items absorbed moisture and cold, making them liabilities. This enforced minimalism was not ideological. It was situational. The lack of fireplaces reinforced it by limiting dry, warm storage areas. Everything inside the house had to justify its presence by being useful across seasons. Social discipline emerged from these conditions. People learned when to speak, when to move, and when to conserve. Winter rewarded those who paid attention and penalized those who acted impulsively. Loud arguments, careless use of fuel, or unnecessary risk-taking created immediate consequences. Over time, this fostered a culture that valued restraint and foresight. These traits later became associated with Viking effectiveness in exploration and trade, but they were forged at home, not at sea. Winter was the training ground. It taught patience through repetition and humility through limitation. The absence of fireplaces played a quiet role in this education. Without stable indoor heat, no one could afford to ignore the environment entirely. Weather was felt directly, even indoors. This constant awareness prevented detachment from natural cycles. Seasons were not abstract concepts measured by calendars. They were experienced physically, daily, and without filter. This grounded perspective influenced how Vikings understood time. Years were remembered by events and conditions rather than by precise dates. A winter might be recalled as harsh or manageable, short or lingering, based on lived experience rather than measurement. Memory organized itself around endurance rather than achievement. Even leadership was shaped by this context. Authority during winter often fell to those who managed resources calmly and consistently, rather than those who commanded forcefully. Good leaders were those who ensured that fires lasted, food was rationed sensibly, and conflicts were kept small. Charisma mattered less than reliability. The lack of fireplaces made leadership visible. A poor decision affected everyone quickly. Success was quiet and largely invisible, marked by the absence of disaster. This reinforced a preference for steady, unremarkable governance. Archaeological patterns suggest that settlements with these qualities persisted longer and adapted better over time. Winter did not eliminate inequality or conflict, but it constrained them. There was little space for excess display or personal comfort when basic survival required collective effort. This constraint created a level of social cohesion that might not have emerged under easier conditions. Looking back, it becomes clear that Viking survival without fireplaces was not an accidental outcome. It was the result of a system in balance with its limitations. The longhouse, the hearth, the clothing, the food, and the social rules all work together, not to create comfort, but to prevent collapse. Modern interpretations often search for clever techniques or missing technologies, but the truth is quieter. Vikings survived because they accepted that winter would always be difficult and designed their lives accordingly. They did not wait for better solutions. They repeated the ones that worked. Over time, those repetitions accumulated into resilience. Fireplaces would eventually change details, but they did not alter the underlying lesson. Survival in harsh climates depends less on eliminating discomfort than on aligning expectations with reality. For the Vikings, that alignment was learned early, practiced annually, and reinforced by every winter that passed without catastrophe. That annual reinforcement, winter passing without catastrophe, quietly validated the entire way of life and made radical change feel unnecessary, even when conditions were harsh. When a system works often enough, people stop questioning it, and Viking winter survival was exactly that kind of system. The absence of fireplaces did not inspire constant dissatisfaction because there was no competing standard of comfort to compare against. There were no warm interiors elsewhere to envy, no stories of evenly heated rooms circulating as missed opportunities. What existed was known, shared, and sufficient. This removed a great deal of psychological friction. Discomfort that is expected is easier to bear than discomfort that feels avoidable. In this sense, Viking winters were difficult but not demoralizing. Everyone knew the limits in advance. The cold would come, darkness would stretch, smoke would hang in the air, food would become repetitive. None of this was surprising, and because it was not surprising, it was manageable. The lack of fireplaces also meant that winter never became invisible. Even indoors, people remained connected to the outside environment through temperature shifts, wind noise, and light changes. This prevented the illusion of separation between human life and nature. Modern heating systems often allow people to forget the season entirely, but Viking households never had that luxury. Winter announced itself constantly, and life responded accordingly. This awareness shaped decision-making at every level. Risk was assessed conservatively, supplies were guarded, energy was conserved. These habits extended beyond winter into how Vikings approached uncertainty in general. When planning voyages, raids, or migrations, they carried the same mindset: assume hardship, prepare thoroughly, and avoid unnecessary waste. Winter survival at home was a rehearsal every other challenge. The longhouse, despite its discomforts, provided a stable environment for this rehearsal. Its limitations were predictable, and predictability allowed planning. Even illness was approached with this acceptance. Sickness in winter was feared, but not dramatized. Care focused on warmth, rest, and food rather than intervention. Recovery was slow, and outcomes were uncertain, but the process was familiar. This familiarity reduced panic and allowed households to function even when weakened. The absence of fireplaces did not cause illness directly, but it removed any expectation that the environment would assist recovery. Healing depended on patience rather than conditions. Death, when it occurred, was folded into the season without ceremony. Losses were remembered, but winter continued. This emotional containment was not coldness, it was practicality. Excess grief did not produce warmth or food. Life required continuation. Over time, this restraint became cultural habit. Even celebrations were subdued during winter months. Festivals acknowledged survival milestones, but they did not overturn the basic rhythm of conservation. Noise, light, and excess were temporary and controlled. The fire remained central and watched. When festivities ended, routines resumed immediately. The lack of fireplaces reinforced this discipline by limiting how much excess activity could occur indoors without cost. Too much light burned too much fuel. Too much cooking strained supplies. Even joy had to be measured. From a modern perspective, this might seem joyless, but within the context of survival, it was stabilizing. Emotional moderation prevented extremes that could destabilize the household. Archaeological interpretations suggest that Viking communities were not constantly on the brink of collapse during winter. They operated within a narrow but sustainable margin. That margin existed because expectations were low, cooperation was high, and habits were well practiced. Fireplaces would later widen that margin slightly, offering cleaner air and more stable warmth, but they did not replace the need for restraint. The core lessons remained relevant. When warmth is costly, behavior adapts. People move less, share more, and think ahead. These adaptations, repeated year after year, shaped a culture capable of persistence in harsh climates. In the end, the absence of fireplaces was not a puzzle that Vikings solved. It was a condition they accepted and organized around. Their success lay not in overcoming cold, but in refusing to let it dictate panic or excess. Winter was allowed to be winter. Homes were allowed to be imperfect. Survival was measured not by comfort achieved, but by continuity maintained. And as long as spring returned and people were still there to meet it, the system was considered to be working. That sense of a system quietly working shaped how Vikings understood success itself, particularly during winter when visible achievements were rare and unnecessary. Success was not expansion, improvement, or comfort. It was simply the absence of collapse. The lack of fireplaces fit neatly into this worldview because it removed any illusion that survival could be effortless. Every warm moment had a cause, and every mistake had a cost. This clarity simplified decision-making. When conditions are difficult by default, priorities become obvious. Keep the fire alive. Keep food from running out. Keep people close enough to share heat and far enough apart to function. Everything else was secondary. Winter sharpened this focus by stripping life down to essentials. There were no distractions created by comfort, no separate rooms to retreat into, no private warmth to hide mistakes. The shared interior of the longhouse ensured that behavior remained visible and, therefore, regulated. People learned quickly what actions helped the group and which ones quietly endangered it. This learning did not require formal rules or punishment. Cold was an efficient teacher. The absence of fireplaces also shaped how Vikings thought about improvement. Instead of seeking dramatic changes, they favored small refinements that did not introduce risk. Adding more turf to walls, adjusting roof angles, improving door seals, or storing fuel more carefully were all safer than rethinking heating entirely. These changes accumulated slowly, generation by generation, producing houses that were marginally better at retaining warmth without altering the basic structure. This incremental approach reduced the chance of failure during winter, when experimentation could be fatal. In this way, Viking innovation was conservative, guided by survival rather than comfort. Even when better ideas existed elsewhere, adopting them required proof that they would not disrupt the fragile balance of winter life. Fireplaces with chimneys, for example, improved air quality and heat control, but they also required new materials, skills, and maintenance. Until those costs were justified, the open hearth remained acceptable, not ideal, but adequate. Winter also influenced how Vikings related to uncertainty. Because the environment was always capable of becoming worse, optimism was measured. Plans accounted for failure. Supplies were stored with margins. People prepared for the possibility that winter might last longer than expected, or that food stores might run lower than planned. This cautious mindset did not eliminate hardship, but it reduced surprise. When conditions deteriorated, responses were already practiced. The lack of fireplaces reinforced this by keeping households constantly aware of environmental shifts. A sudden drop in temperature was felt immediately. Wind direction mattered. Snow accumulation changed insulation. Nothing was abstract. This constant feedback loop helped households adjust quickly without needing complex systems. Social trust grew from this shared awareness. Everyone experienced the same conditions, so explanations were rarely needed. If the fire burned low, the reason was obvious. If movement slowed, it was understood. This reduced conflict and unnecessary communication. Winter favored quiet cooperation over negotiation. Over time, this dynamic strengthened group cohesion. People depended on one another not emotionally, but practically. Dependence built reliability. Reliability built trust. Trust made endurance easier. Even the emotional tone of winter life reflected this pragmatism. There was little room for despair, but also little indulgence in hope. The future was assumed to be difficult until proven otherwise. This assumption prevented disappointment and stabilized morale. Spring was welcomed, but not assumed. It arrived when it arrived. Until then, winter routines continued without complaint. The absence of fireplaces supported this emotional balance by keeping expectations aligned with reality. No one expected to be warm. They expected to survive. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to view this as deprivation. But deprivation implies that something expected is missing. In the Viking world, even warmth was not expected. It was conditional, temporary, and shared. This made its absence tolerable and its presence meaningful. A well-maintained fire was noticed. A slightly warmer night was appreciated. These small variations mattered because the baseline was modest. Comfort, when it occurred, felt earned rather than owed. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that this mindset was effective. Communities persisted. Populations recovered after hard winters. Knowledge accumulated. Life continued. The lack of fireplaces did not stop Vikings from thriving within their own definition of success. That definition was narrow but sustainable. It did not aim to eliminate hardship. It aimed to keep hardship from becoming fatal. In this sense, Viking winter survival was not about resilience in the modern motivational sense. It was about alignment. Homes, habits, and expectations were aligned closely enough with environmental reality that survival became routine rather than heroic. The cold did not demand admiration. It demanded attention. And Vikings gave it exactly that, quietly, consistently, and without complaint, until winter loosened its grip once again. When winter finally loosened its grip, the change was gradual enough that it did not disrupt the habits built over months of restraint, and this gradualness was important. Sudden relief might have encouraged waste or carelessness, but spring arrived unevenly, with cold nights lingering long after daylight returned. Fires were still needed, clothing remained layered, and no one dismantled winter routines all at once. The absence of fireplaces meant that there was no sharp transition from cold to warm indoors. Instead, comfort increased slowly, allowing behavior to adjust without shock. This continuity reduced risk. People did not rush. They resumed outdoor work cautiously, conserving energy that had been carefully protected through winter. The longhouse remained central, but doors opened more often, letting in light and fresh air that thinned the smoke and lifted spirits without changing expectations. The hearth still burned, but it was no longer the sole anchor of daily life. This transition highlighted how winter survival without fireplaces shaped resilience beyond the season itself. Households emerged from winter intact, not because conditions improved suddenly, but because their systems allowed gradual recovery. Tools repaired during winter were ready for use. Bodies rested through reduced activity regained strength. Social bonds reinforced through proximity carried into busier months. Nothing needed to be rebuilt emotionally because nothing had been broken. The absence of fireplaces had forced reliance on habits rather than infrastructure, and habits are easier to carry forward than structures. Even as spring work intensified, winter discipline lingered. Fuel was still valued. Food was still managed carefully. Waste was still noticed. These behaviors did not vanish with warmth. They remained embedded, providing a buffer against future uncertainty. In this way, winter trained people for scarcity, even when scarcity was no longer immediate. Archaeological patterns suggest that this carried long-term benefits. Communities accustomed to winter restraint were better positioned to absorb unexpected losses, such as poor harvests or storms, without collapsing. Their margin for error, though narrow, was well understood. Fireplaces, when they eventually became more common, expanded that margin slightly, but they did not eliminate the need for these ingrained behaviors. Better heating reduced discomfort, but it did not replace the social systems built around shared endurance. The Viking approach to winter survival without fireplaces thus reveals something understated but important about human adaptation. Technology is only one part of survival. When technology is limited, culture compensates. Expectations shift, behavior changes. Systems emerge that distribute risk and responsibility. In the Viking world, the lack of fireplaces forced warmth to remain a collective concern rather than a personal one. This discouraged isolation and reinforced mutual dependence. Everyone had a stake in the fire. Everyone felt its loss. This shared vulnerability strengthened coordination without requiring ideology or enforcement. It simply worked. Modern discussions of resilience often focus on innovation, flexibility, and growth. Viking winter survival suggests a quieter model. Resilience can also come from repetition, modesty, and refusal to overextend. By not expecting comfort, Vikings avoided the disappointment that undermines morale. By not redesigning life around rare moments of warmth, they preserved stability. Winter did not become a crisis to solve. It became a condition to manage. The absence of fireplaces made that condition visible at all times, preventing denial. In the end, surviving Arctic winters without fireplaces did not rely on exceptional toughness or clever design. It relied on a shared understanding of limits and a collective willingness to live within them. Homes leaked heat, but habits conserved it. Bodies grew cold, but expectations stayed realistic. The fire burned imperfectly, but it burned often enough, and when it went out, it was restarted together. This pattern repeated year after year until survival felt ordinary. That ordinariness is easy to overlook from a distance, but it is the most telling detail of all. Viking winters were not endured through dramatic struggle. They were endured through calm repetition, quiet cooperation, and acceptance of a world where warmth was never guaranteed. In such a world, the absence of fireplaces was not a flaw. It was simply part of the landscape of life, one more constraint around which people learned, slowly and patiently, to continue. That continuation, learning patiently within constraints, was ultimately what allowed Viking communities to persist across generations in environments that offered little forgiveness. Each winter reinforced a shared understanding that survival was cumulative, built from many small, correct decisions rather than dramatic acts. The absence of fireplaces ensured that this lesson was never abstract. Cold was felt directly, every day, reminding people that attention mattered. Fire management remained a central skill, not because it was technically complex, but because it demanded consistency. Fires had to be fed carefully, not enthusiastically. Too little fuel risked freezing. Too much risked scarcity later. This balance shaped a mindset comfortable with moderation. It also encouraged observation. People became attuned to subtle changes in weather, drafts in the house, and the behavior of the fire itself. These observations guided daily adjustments without discussion. Over time, this attentiveness extended beyond winter tasks into broader life skills. The same care used to manage heat was applied to managing livestock, planning travel, and negotiating social relationships. Nothing was rushed unnecessarily. Winter rewarded those who noticed small changes early and responded calmly. The lack of fireplaces also reinforced humility toward the environment. There was no sense that nature could be controlled indoors. Snowstorms and cold snaps were accepted as facts rather than challenges to overcome. This acceptance reduced conflict between expectation and reality, which in turn reduced stress. People focused on what could be influenced rather than what could not. This focus conserved emotional energy as effectively as physical energy. Within the longhouse, routines continued with minimal variation. Meals were eaten, tools repaired, stories told, and sleep taken when possible. The repetition itself provided comfort, even if the conditions did not. Familiarity softened hardship. When conditions were harsh but predictable, the mind adjusted. This adjustment was perhaps the most important survival mechanism of all. Fireplaces might have improved air quality and warmth, but they would not have replaced the psychological stability created by routine. Viking winter life demonstrates that stability does not require comfort, it requires reliability. As long as the fire could be restarted, food remained, and people cooperated, winter was survivable. The absence of fireplaces kept these requirements visible and honest. Nothing hid the cost of warmth or the effort behind it. This transparency shaped values that favored patience, restraint, and shared responsibility. Even as technology slowly advanced, these values remained useful. When fireplaces eventually appeared, they were incorporated into existing patterns rather than transforming them. Better heating reduced some discomfort, but it did not eliminate the need for careful planning or cooperation. Winter remained a season of conservation, even if it became slightly less harsh. Looking back, the Viking ability to survive Arctic winters without fireplaces appears less like a mystery and more like a lesson in alignment. Life was organized around environmental limits rather than aspirations of comfort. Homes were imperfect, but habits were strong. Heat was unreliable, but expectations were realistic. These conditions created a form of resilience that did not depend on progress or innovation. It depended on repetition and acceptance. In modern contexts, where discomfort is often framed as a problem to fix immediately, this approach feels foreign. Yet it was precisely this approach that allowed Viking societies to endure year after year. They did not ask winter to change. They changed themselves, slowly and collectively, until survival became routine. In that routine, the absence of fireplaces ceased to matter. It was simply one of many limits that defined the shape of life. And within those limits, life continued, quietly and steadily, until spring returned once more. Spring's return did not erase the memory of winter, but it softened it just enough that preparation for the next one could begin without dread. In the Viking world, winter was never truly over. It simply moved from present reality to future planning. The absence of fireplaces ensured that this transition remained grounded. Warmth had not suddenly become abundant, so caution lingered. Wood was still gathered when possible. Repairs continued. Roofs were checked. Walls were reinforced. Everything done in spring and summer carried an unspoken purpose. Make the next winter slightly less demanding without assuming it could ever be easy. This forward-looking restraint shaped how effort was distributed across the year. People did not work harder because conditions were pleasant. They worked deliberately because comfort was temporary. The longhouse, unchanged at its core, accumulated small improvements that reflected lessons learned during the previous cold season. A draft blocked here, a door adjusted there, a hearth edge reinforced to hold embers more reliably overnight. None of these changes transformed winter life, but each reduced friction just enough to matter. The lack of fireplaces meant that these refinements were always modest and reversible. Nothing depended on a single innovation. If something failed, the system absorbed it. This redundancy was intentional. Viking households avoided reliance on fragile solutions because winter punished fragility quickly. Social habits followed the same pattern. Cooperation built during winter did not dissolve in summer. It relaxed, but it did not disappear. Trust established under pressure carried forward, shaping how labor was shared and conflicts managed. People who had survived months in close quarters without reliable heat learned each other's limits well. This familiarity reduced misunderstanding later. In this way, winter functioned as a social filter, strengthening bonds that could endure stress and quietly revealing those that could not. The absence of fireplaces intensified this process by keeping everyone exposed to the same conditions. No one escaped discomfort entirely. Shared exposure created shared understanding. Over time, this understanding became cultural instinct. Children raised in this environment learned not just practical skills, but emotional calibration. They learned when to expect ease and when not to. They learned that some seasons demanded patience rather than action. This lesson stayed with them into adulthood, shaping decision-making far beyond the longhouse. Even Viking expansion outward into trade and exploration reflected this internal discipline. Voyages were planned with margins, supplies were rationed, risk was acknowledged rather than denied. These behaviors mirrored winter survival strategies at home. In both cases, success depended on accepting limits rather than challenging them recklessly. The lack of fireplaces did not hinder this mindset. It reinforced it by making limits impossible to ignore. Looking across centuries of settlement, it becomes clear that Viking survival in cold climates was not accidental. It was the outcome of a system that valued durability over comfort, predictability over optimization, and cooperation over individual convenience. Fireplaces would eventually improve living conditions, but they arrived into a culture already optimized for endurance. They softened winter, but they did not redefine it. The underlying structure of life remained shaped by the assumption that warmth was earned, temporary, and shared. This assumption did not produce ease, but it produced continuity. And continuity was the true measure of success. When viewed without modern expectations, the Viking winter longhouse was not a place of suffering so much as a place of waiting. Waiting for light, waiting for movement, waiting for the slow turning of seasons. The absence of fireplaces did not interrupt this waiting. It structured it. It gave winter its shape and taught people how to inhabit it without panic or excess. In the end, Vikings did not survive Arctic winters without fireplaces by overcoming cold. They survived by making cold an ordinary part of life, something accounted for rather than feared. That ordinariness, practiced year after year, carried them through centuries of harsh seasons with quiet persistence. That quiet persistence reveals something subtle about Viking winter life that is easy to miss when focusing only on physical hardship. Surviving without fireplaces was not just about enduring cold, but about maintaining mental steadiness in conditions that rarely offered immediate reward. Winter provided very little feedback. Days passed without visible progress. Effort did not lead to improvement, only to maintenance. Fires burned, food diminished, and darkness lingered, regardless of how well people behaved. This could have been deeply discouraging, but the Viking system did not frame winter as a season for achievement. It framed it as a season for preservation. In doing so, it removed the pressure to see results. The absence of fireplaces reinforced this framing by eliminating the expectation that effort should produce comfort. You could tend the fire perfectly and still be cold. That was normal. Effort was judged by continuity, not outcome. This perspective protected morale. People were less likely to feel that their work was failing them because success was defined narrowly as getting through another day intact. This narrow definition mattered. It prevented emotional exhaustion in an environment already taxing the body. Winter tasks were repetitive and modest by design. Repetition reduced decision fatigue. There were few choices to make, and most had already been made by tradition. This freed mental energy for vigilance rather than creativity. Fireplaces, had they existed in modern form, might have encouraged experimentation with comfort, rearranging space, or individual preference. The open hearth did not allow that. It demanded adherence to known patterns. That adherence stabilized daily life. Even boredom served a purpose. With little novelty, time slowed, and attention turned inward. Small changes in the fire, the weather, or the mood of the household became noticeable. This heightened sensitivity helped people respond quickly to problems before they escalated. The absence of fireplaces also limited distraction. Smoke, cold, and low light discouraged unnecessary activity. People did less, but they did what mattered. This focus was not virtuous in an abstract sense. It was practical. Winter punished excess. Over time, this punishment shaped instinct. People learned to conserve effort instinctively without moralizing it. Rest was not laziness. Stillness was not failure. They were strategies. In this environment, resilience did not look like toughness or enthusiasm. It looked like patience. Archaeological evidence supports this understated picture. There are few signs of winter-specific innovations aimed at comfort, but many signs of long-term settlement continuity. This suggests that households did not feel compelled to redesign winter life constantly. The system was uncomfortable but stable. Fireplaces would later improve stability by reducing smoke and increasing heat control, but they did not fundamentally change winter's role. Winter remained a season of reduced activity and increased caution. The Viking experience without fireplaces shows that survival systems do not need to feel good to work well. They need to be predictable and shared. Cold that everyone expects is less destabilizing than warmth that comes and goes unpredictably. By keeping warmth modest and effort visible, the open hearth kept expectations aligned. This alignment allowed people to endure months of hardship without emotional collapse. In modern contexts, discomfort often feels intolerable because it violates expectation. In the Viking world, discomfort confirmed expectation. That confirmation reduced stress. Winter was not an emergency. It was a condition, and conditions, once accepted, can be managed calmly. This calm management, repeated year after year, was the quiet strength of Viking winter life. It did not produce stories of heroism. It produced continuity. And continuity, in a harsh climate without fireplaces, was the most meaningful success available. That continuity, quietly preserved through winters that offered no rewards beyond survival, explains why Viking life appears so restrained when viewed closely, especially indoors. Without fireplaces to soften the edges of winter, nothing encouraged excess optimism. There was no sense that conditions might suddenly improve if one tried harder. Effort did not negotiate with the cold. It merely kept it from winning too quickly. This understanding shaped a form of emotional economy. Feelings were managed the same way fuel and food were managed, carefully, steadily, and without waste. Excitement was rare in winter because it consumed energy without producing warmth. Anger was contained because conflict burned resources better spent elsewhere. Even grief, while real, was expressed in controlled ways because winter did not pause to accommodate it. The absence of fireplaces reinforced this emotional discipline by keeping the environment uniformly demanding. No corner of the longhouse allowed escape from the season. This lack of escape reduced comparison and envy. Everyone experienced roughly the same discomfort, and that sameness mattered. It simplified social relationships. When conditions are equally difficult for all, fairness becomes easier to maintain. Status still existed, but it offered limited insulation from cold. Authority brought responsibility rather than comfort. Leaders could not retreat to warmer spaces. They endured alongside others, which reinforced legitimacy. This dynamic helped maintain order without constant enforcement. Winter itself enforced moderation. The longhouse became a place where life slowed to its minimum functional speed. Tasks were done deliberately. Movement was measured. Noise was limited. The rhythm of days became repetitive enough that it faded into the background, allowing people to focus on maintaining rather than striving. This state of maintenance is often undervalued in historical narratives, which favor moments of change and expansion. But maintenance is what allows change to happen later. Viking exploration, trade, and cultural influence depended on surviving countless ordinary winters first. Without fireplaces, those winters were not comfortable, but they were predictable. Predictability allowed planning. Planning allowed continuity. Continuity allowed growth when conditions permitted it. In this sense, winter life was not separate from Viking success. It was foundational. The habits formed in smoke-filled longhouses translated directly into how Vikings approached uncertainty elsewhere. Ships were built with redundancy. Voyages carried margins. Settlements were established cautiously. Risk was taken, but only after preparation. This approach mirrors winter survival exactly. Expect difficulty. Prepare thoroughly. Accept that conditions will not cooperate. Proceed anyway, carefully. The absence of fireplaces trained this mindset every year. Cold reminded people of limits. Limits clarified priorities. Over time, this clarity became cultural instinct. Even when later generations encountered improved heating and shelter, the instinct remained. Comfort did not replace caution. It merely reduced immediate strain. Looking back, the question of how Vikings survived Arctic winters without fireplaces becomes less about missing technology and more about appropriate expectations. They did not imagine winter as something that could be fixed. They imagined it as something that had to be lived through. That difference shaped everything. Homes were not sealed from the world. They were buffered against it just enough. Life was not optimized for pleasure. It was optimized for persistence. And persistence, practiced quietly across generations, proved to be enough. Winter came, stayed longer than anyone wanted, and eventually left. People noticed, adjusted, and continued. Fires burned low. Smoke lingered. Cold pressed in. And still, life went on. Not triumphantly, not comfortably, just steadily. That steadiness, more than any architectural feature or missing fireplace, is what allowed Vikings to remain in places that seemed determined to push them away. That steadiness, uncelebrated and largely invisible, was the final outcome of Viking winter survival. And it is also the reason the question of fireplaces feels almost beside the point once examined closely. Fireplaces promise comfort, control, and separation from the environment. Viking winter life promised none of these things. Instead, it offered familiarity. The cold behaved as expected. The fire behaved as expected. The longhouse behaved as expected. And within those expectations, people learned exactly how much effort was required to keep everything from falling apart. This knowledge was practical, embodied, and deeply boring, which is precisely why it worked. Nothing relied on sudden improvement. Nothing depended on optimism. Every part of life assumed that winter would remain difficult until it ended on its own. The absence of fireplaces ensured that no one forgot this assumption. Warmth was always partial. Smoke was always present. Cold was always waiting a few steps away from the hearth. This constant reminder kept attention sharp without producing panic. People did not fight winter. They monitored it. They adjusted to it. They endured it one day at a time without expecting gratitude or reward. Over generations, this endurance became unremarkable. Children grew into adults who did not question why homes were cold or why heat was uneven. They learned how to live correctly within those conditions because correctness mattered more than comfort. Correct behavior kept the fire alive. Correct behavior kept food stores intact. Correct behavior kept people alive long enough to see another spring. Fireplaces, when they eventually appeared, improved details, but they did not replace this deeper logic. Even with better heating, winter still demanded preparation, restraint, and cooperation. The technology softened the edges, but it did not change the season's role as a test of continuity. Looking back, the Viking ability to survive Arctic winters without fireplaces was not a story of hardship overcome or ingenuity triumphing over nature. It was a story of alignment. Life was shaped to match conditions rather than resist them. Expectations were lowered until reality no longer felt hostile, just demanding. Homes were imperfect, but habits were reliable. Warmth was limited, but shared. Discomfort was constant, but familiar. And familiarity, more than comfort, is what allows humans to persist in difficult environments. The Viking longhouse in winter was not warm, not clean, and not especially safe by modern standards, but it was predictable. And predictability allowed people to settle into routines that carried them through months of darkness without collapse. In that sense, the absence of fireplaces did not define Viking winter life as a failure waiting to be corrected. It defined it as a condition around which an entire culture quietly organized itself. Winter came. People adjusted. Fire burned low. Stories repeated. Time passed. Spring returned. And because that sequence held, year after year, it became ordinary. Surviving without fireplaces was never meant to be impressive. It was meant to be sufficient. And for the Vikings, sufficient was all that was required.